Vienna in the early 1930s was a symphony of contrasts. The grandeur of its palaces and the hum of its bustling coffeehouses clashed with the lingering shadows of economic depression. Snow dusted the cobblestone streets, muffling the sounds of carriage wheels and the hurried footsteps of the city's residents. Peter Schmidt, a 38-year-old composer, thrived in the city's vibrancy. Though his music had yet to gain widespread fame, his works were known among the smaller circles of the Viennese artistic elite. His life revolved around the melodies he created, each note a reflection of his inner world. But it was Elizabeth who gave those melodies their meaning. His wife of 10 years, Elizabeth was a violinist of extraordinary talent. She had once been on the cusp of stardom, performing in Europe's grandest concert halls. Yet, after marrying Peter, she chose a quieter life, teaching music to children and playing occasionally at local events. Their modest apartment, situated on the edge of the Danube, was filled with the signs of their shared passion. Sheet music was scattered on every surface, a slightly out-of-tune upright piano stood in the corner, and framed photographs of the couple adorned the walls. "You'll compose a masterpiece one day, Peter." "Ha!" Elizabeth often teased, as she practiced by the window. Her auburn hair glowed in the golden light of the setting sun. "I already have," Peter would reply, his gaze fixed on her. "You?" One crisp November evening, Elizabeth arrived home later than usual. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her eyes alight with excitement. "Peter!" she called, setting her violin case down with a thud. He looked up from the piano where he had been working on a new waltz. You're late! Did something happen?" "Something wonderful," she said, removing her scarf. "Herr Anton Lehmann has invited me to perform at his private reception next week." Peter's brow furrowed slightly. "Lehmann? The patron of the conservatory?" "The very same," Elizabeth replied, her voice bubbling with enthusiasm. "He's hosting an event at his estate, and he wants me to play for his guests. Do you know what this could mean for the conservatory? For us?" Peter stood, crossing the room to her. "For us? Or for your career?" "Both," she said, placing her hands on his chest. "If this goes well, Lehmann could fund the conservatory for years. Imagine how many students we could take on, how much we could expand. It's an opportunity we can't afford to miss." Peter hesitated. "I suppose I'll come with you then?" Elizabeth shook her head, her expression softening. "It's a private event, Peter. Only performers and his guests are invited." He stepped back, a flicker of unease in his chest. "So, I'm not welcome?" "Oh, it's not about that," she said quickly. "This is business, not personal." Peter forced a smile. "Then you'll play beautifully, Lise. Just don't forget who you're really playing for." The night of the reception, Elizabeth dressed with a care Peter hadn't seen in years. She wore a deep burgundy gown that clung to her figure, paired with a string of pearls he had given her on their 5th anniversary. As she fastened her earrings, Peter stood in the doorway, watching her with a mixture of pride and unease. "You look stunning," he said softly. "Thank you," she replied, turning to kiss him. "Don't wait up for me, all right? These events tend to run late." Peter nodded, though a knot tightened in his stomach. When Elizabeth returned in the early hours of the morning, she was quieter than usual. Peter woke to the sound of her footsteps and found her standing by the window, staring out at the snow-covered streets. "Liz," he murmured, sitting up. "Everything all right?" She turned, startled. "Yes, of course. Go back to sleep, Peter." But he couldn't. The unease from earlier had taken root, and no amount of rationalizing could shake it. In the weeks following the reception, Peter began to notice changes in Elizabeth. She stayed out late more often, citing rehearsals and meetings with potential patrons. When she was home, she seemed distracted, her laughter less frequent, her touch more fleeting. Peter tried to ignore the gnawing suspicion in his chest. He told himself she was simply busy, focused on her music and the opportunities Lehman had promised. But when he saw her staring at a letter one evening, her expression unreadable, he couldn't help but wonder. One day, while tidying her desk, Peter found the letter tucked beneath a stack of sheet music. The handwriting was elegant, the words intimate. "Dearest Elizabeth, your performance was enchanting, as are you. I find myself eager for the next time we can meet. Please, let me know when you are free for dinner." It was signed Anton Lehman. Peter's hand shook as he folded the letter and placed it back where he found it. That evening he tried to act as though nothing had changed, but his silence spoke volumes. "Peter, are you all right?" Elizabeth asked as they ate dinner. He looked up, forcing a smile. "Just tired. The waltz I'm working on is giving me trouble." She nodded, but her gaze lingered on him, as though she sensed the storm brewing beneath the surface. The tension between them grew with each passing day. Peter couldn't bring himself to confront Elizabeth, not without proof. Instead, he began to watch her more closely, noting her movements, her excuses, the way she avoided meeting his gaze. One snowy evening, Elizabeth told him she had a rehearsal that would run late. Peter waited until she left, then followed her. The streets of Vienna were quiet, the snow muffling the sound of his footsteps. He kept his distance as she walked through the city, eventually arriving at the Grand Hotel Imperial. From the shadows of the street, Peter watched as Elizabeth entered the hotel, her burgundy coat standing out against the white marble facade. Through the frosted windows, he saw her greet Anton Lehman with a smile. They sat together in the restaurant, their heads close as they spoke. Peter felt as though the ground beneath him had given way. The woman he had loved, trusted, and built his life around was sitting with another man, her laughter carrying through the glass like a dagger to his heart. Unable to bear the sight, Peter pushed open the hotel doors and entered the restaurant. The sound of his boots on the marble floor echoed in the grand space, drawing the attention of several patrons. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice trembling with anger and heartbreak. She turned, her face paling as she saw him. "Peter?" Anton Lehman rose, his expression calm but condescending. "Herr Schmidt, perhaps we should discuss this privately." Peter ignored him, his eyes fixed on Elizabeth. "Is this why you've been staying out late? Lying to me? For him?" "Peter, it's not what you think," Elizabeth stammered, her voice barely audible. "Then tell me what it is," he demanded, his voice rising. Her silence was all the confirmation he needed. Peter left the hotel without another word, the chill of the night cutting through his coat as he walked the snowy streets. His mind was a whirlwind of disbelief, anger, and despair. How had it come to this? The woman he adored, the center of his world, had betrayed him. By the time he returned to their apartment, dawn was breaking, and the streets of Vienna were coming to life. Inside, the apartment felt cold and empty. He stood in the living room, staring at the photographs on the mantel, reminders of happier times. His eyes lingered on one of their wedding photos. Elizabeth's smile had seemed so full of promise then. When the door finally opened and Elizabeth stepped inside, her cheeks were red from the cold and her eyes widened when she saw him. "You're awake," she said softly, closing the door behind her. "Of course, I'm awake," Peter replied, his voice cold. "How could I sleep, knowing what I saw tonight?" Elizabeth froze, her hands clutching the lapels of her coat. "Peter, "Don't," he interrupted, raising a hand. "Don't insult me with excuses." Tears welled in her eyes as she stepped closer. It wasn't what it looked like. "Please, let me explain." Peter laughed bitterly. "It wasn't? So you weren't having dinner with him? You weren't laughing at his jokes, letting him touch your hand like I don't exist?" "Peter, I never meant to hurt you," Elizabeth whispered, her voice breaking. He turned away, his fists clenched. "Do you even realize what you've done? You've destroyed us, Elizabeth. I don't even know who you are anymore." "I love you," she said desperately, tears streaming down her face. "Please don't say it's over. I can end this. I will end it. Just give me a chance." Peter turned to face her, his expression hardened. "You had your chance, Liz, and you threw it away." Without another word, he walked into the bedroom, shutting the door behind him. The following morning, Peter packed a suitcase. Elizabeth stood in the doorway, watching him with a mixture of desperation and helplessness. "Peter, please," she pleaded. "Don't leave. We can fix this." Peter zipped the suitcase shut and straightened, his movements mechanical. "There's nothing left to fix, Liz. You made your choice." "I made a mistake," she said, her voice trembling. "A terrible mistake. But we can move past this. I love you." Peter shook his head, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Love isn't supposed to feel like this. Love doesn't betray. Goodbye, Elizabeth." As he walked past her, suitcase in hand, she reached out to stop him, but he pulled away. The door closed behind him, leaving her standing alone in the empty apartment. Peter took a train to Salzburg, seeking solace in the quiet beauty of the mountains. He rented a small attic room above a bookstore, its modest furnishings a stark contrast to the home he had left behind. Each day, he threw himself into his music, composing pieces that reflected the depth of his heartbreak. His symphonies were raw, filled with haunting melodies that seemed to echo his pain. The owner of the bookstore, Frau Reinhardt, took an interest in him. A widow in her 60s, she often brought him tea and pastries, sensing the weight he carried. "You have the look of a man who's lost everything," she said one afternoon as she set a plate of biscuits on his desk. Peter glanced up from his sheet music, offering a faint smile. "You're not wrong. If you ever need to talk, I'm a good listener," she said kindly. Though Peter rarely spoke of his past, her presence was a comfort. She reminded him that kindness still existed, even in the face of heartbreak. Back in Vienna, Elizabeth struggled to cope with Peter's absence. The apartment felt empty without him, and every corner was a reminder of what she had lost. She wrote to him often, pouring her heart into letters she wasn't even sure he would read. "Peter, I know I've hurt you in ways I can never undo, but I need you to know how deeply I regret what I've done. You were my world, and I betrayed that. Please, if there's any part of you that can forgive me, let me try to make it right." Peter never replied. Elizabeth tried to distract herself with her work, but her music felt hollow. The students she taught sensed her sadness, and the joy she once found in playing her violin seemed to slip further from her grasp. 2 years passed. Peter's music began to gain recognition beyond Salzburg. His symphonies, filled with raw emotion, captivated audiences and brought him invitations to perform across Europe. One day, he received a letter from the Salzburg Music Festival, inviting him to showcase one of his symphonies as the centerpiece of their program. Though hesitant, Peter accepted, knowing it was an opportunity he couldn't ignore. The night of the performance, Peter sat in the audience, his heart heavy with anticipation. When the lead violinist stepped forward for her solo, Peter froze. It was Elizabeth. Elizabeth's playing was unlike anything Peter had ever heard. Every note was infused with a depth of emotion that spoke of love, regret, and longing. The audience was enraptured, but Peter couldn't take his eyes off her. When the symphony ended, the applause was deafening. Elizabeth stood to take her bow, her eyes scanning the crowd. When they found Peter, she paused, her breath catching. Peter nodded, his expression unreadable. After the performance, Peter lingered outside the theater, the cold night air sharp against his face. He couldn't bring himself to leave just yet. The music still lingered in his mind, each note a reminder of the life he had shared with Elizabeth. The sound of footsteps behind him made him turn. There she was, wrapped in a long coat, her violin case in hand. Her breath formed small clouds in the frosty air as she approached him cautiously. "Peter," she said softly, her voice trembling. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Elizabeth." She hesitated, clutching the strap of her violin case. "I didn't know you'd be here." "I didn't know you were the soloist," he replied, his tone even. "You played beautifully." Tears welled in her eyes. "It was your symphony. How could I not give it everything I had?" Peter looked away, the emotions he had tried to bury stirring to the surface. "Why are you here, Liz? What do you want?" "I wanted to see you," she said, stepping closer, "to tell you that I've never stopped loving you." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Love isn't enough, Elizabeth. It wasn't enough to stop you from breaking us." She nodded, tears spilling over. "I know, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But please, Peter, just tell me, do you think you could ever forgive me?" Peter was silent for a long moment, the weight of her question hanging between them. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I've spent years trying to move on, to forget. But seeing you tonight," he shook his head, "it's like reopening an old wound." "I understand," she whispered. "I just needed to tell you that I'm sorry, and that I'll always be sorry." Peter nodded, his expression softening. "Goodbye, Liz." "Goodbye, Peter," she said, her voice breaking as she turned and walked away. That night, Peter sat at his desk, staring at a blank sheet of paper. He had so much he wanted to say, yet the words wouldn't come. The memories of their life together flooded his mind. The mornings they spent sipping coffee by the window, the late nights when they created music side by side. He picked up his pen and began to write. "Elizabeth, there are days when I wish I could hate you. It would make things easier. But the truth is, I don't. I never have. You were my world, and losing you broke me in ways I didn't think possible. I'm not sure I'll ever fully heal. But tonight, hearing you play, it reminded me of why I fell in love with you in the first place. Maybe that's why it hurts so much." He paused, the ink pooling on the page. Finally, he folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer. He wasn't ready to send it. In Vienna, Elizabeth returned to the empty apartment that had once been her sanctuary with Peter. She placed her violin on the table and sank into a chair, her hands trembling. Seeing him again had stirred emotions she had tried to suppress, and now the weight of her regret felt heavier than ever. She walked to the mantel where their wedding photo still stood. Peter's smile was warm, his arm wrapped protectively around her. She reached out to touch the frame, her fingers trembling. "I'm so sorry," she whispered to the empty room. Elizabeth spent the next weeks pouring herself into her music. Every note she played was a reflection of her longing, her guilt, and the love she still carried for Peter. Months later, fate intervened. Peter was in Vienna for a meeting with a publisher who had expressed interest in his latest compositions. After the meeting, he decided to visit Café Central, a place he and Elisabeth had frequented in their early years together. As he sipped his coffee, a familiar figure entered the café. Elisabeth. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment neither moved. Finally, Peter raised his hand in a small gesture of acknowledgement. She hesitated, then walked over to his table. "May I join you?" she asked softly. Peter nodded. They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the café filling the space between them. "You look well," Elisabeth said finally. "So do you," Peter replied, his tone guarded. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said, her hands clasped tightly around her teacup. "Nor I you," he said. "But Vienna has a way of pulling people back, doesn't it?" Elisabeth smiled faintly. "It does." Their conversation was hesitant at first, each step forward marked by careful words. But as the minutes passed, the tension began to ease. They spoke of music, of life in Vienna, and of the memories they had once shared. "You've come far, Peter," Elisabeth said, her voice tinged with pride. "Your music is everywhere now." "And you," he replied. "Your playing is incredible. And it always was, but—" Her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. That means more than you know." As the afternoon turned to evening, they parted ways, the conversation leaving both of them with a strange mix of hope and sorrow. Peter returned to Salzburg, where he began work on a new composition. It was unlike anything he had written before, both a lament and a celebration of love, loss, and the enduring power of memory. He called it Elisabeth's Lament. The piece quickly gained attention, hailed as a masterpiece that captured the complexities of the human heart. Years later, Peter received news of Elisabeth's passing. Among her belongings was a letter addressed to him. "Dearest Peter, you are my greatest love and my greatest regret. Thank you for giving me a love so pure, even if I didn't deserve it. I carried it with me, always. Yours forever. Elisabeth." Peter read the letter in silence, tears streaming down his face. Years passed, and Peter Schmidt's name became synonymous with the depth of human emotion. His symphonies captured the frailty, resilience, and beauty of life, but none more so than Elisabeth's Lament. It was the crowning achievement of his career, performed in grand concert halls across Europe and celebrated by critics and audiences alike. But for Peter, the symphony was far more than a professional triumph. It was a vessel for the love, regret, and memories he had carried for decades. Every time it was played, it felt as if he were speaking directly to Elisabeth, across the boundaries of time and mortality. Peter lived quietly in Salzburg, avoiding the limelight that often came with fame. He spent his days composing, his evenings walking through the narrow streets of the city, and his nights immersed in the music that had always been his sanctuary. The attic apartment above the bookstore remained his home, though it had grown cozier over the years, filled with mementos of a life lived fully, if not conventionally. One autumn evening, as Peter sorted through his desk, he came across the letter Elisabeth had left for him. He had read it countless times, but each word still resonated deeply. "Dearest Peter, you were my greatest love and my greatest regret. Thank you for giving me a love so pure, even if I didn't deserve it. I carried it with me, always, yours forever. Elisabeth." The memory of her voice, her laughter, her music, played in his mind as vividly as if she were still there. He didn't cry this time. Instead, he smiled, a bittersweet warmth filling his chest. As Peter grew older, he began to feel the pull of mortality. He knew his time was finite, but he found peace in the legacy he had created. Elizabeth's Lament had become a staple of orchestras worldwide, often played in moments of national mourning or personal reflection. Young musicians would write to him sharing how the piece had touched their lives, how it had helped them process their own heartbreaks. One such letter came from a young violinist in Vienna who had been chosen to perform the solo in Elizabeth's Lament for the first time. Herr Schmidt, your symphony is the most beautiful and challenging piece I've ever played. Every note feels like a conversation, every phrase a story. I can only hope to do justice to the love and sorrow you've captured within it. Thank you for creating something so profoundly human. Peter folded the letter carefully and placed it alongside Elizabeth's. He knew that her memory had not only shaped his music, but had also become a part of the lives of countless others. In his final years, Peter agreed to attend a special tribute concert in Vienna, where Elizabeth's Lament would be performed in its entirety. It was to be held at the Musikverein, the same grand hall where Elizabeth had once dreamed of performing. The evening was a spectacle. The hall was filled with dignitaries, musicians, and admirers of Peter's work. When the orchestra began to play, Peter sat quietly in the front row, his hands trembling slightly as the first notes filled the air. The lead violinist was the young musician who had written to him. She played with a passion and sensitivity that reminded Peter of Elizabeth. Her bow glided across the strings, drawing out each note with a tenderness that brought tears to his eyes. As the final movement swelled, the music seemed to transport Peter back to those early days in their tiny apartment in Vienna. He could see Elizabeth standing by the window, her violin in hand, her auburn hair catching the light. He could hear her laughter, feel the warmth of her presence. When the last note faded, the audience erupted into applause. Peter rose slowly, leaning on his cane as the conductor gestured for him to join the musicians on stage. As he approached, the lead violinist handed him her bow, a symbolic gesture of respect and gratitude. Peter took it, his voice steady but soft as he addressed the crowd. This symphony is not mine alone. It belongs to every heart that has loved, every soul that has endured loss, and most of all, it belongs to Elizabeth. She gave me the gift of love, and even in her absence, she continues to inspire me. Peter passed away peacefully in his sleep a few months after the tribute concert, leaving behind a body of work that would endure for generations. In his will, he requested that his ashes be scattered in Vienna, near the Danube, where he and Elizabeth had once dreamed of taking their children. In the years that followed, Elizabeth's Lament became a cornerstone of classical music. Scholars wrote volumes about its composition, audiences wept during its performances, and musicians regarded it as a sacred piece to master. But for those who knew Peter's story, it was more than a symphony. It was a testament to the enduring power of love and the beauty that can emerge from heartbreak. A plaque was placed near the Danube in Peter's memory, engraved with the final words of the symphony's score. For Elizabeth, who taught me to love even through the pain. And so, their story lived on, not just in music, but in the hearts of those who understood that love, even when imperfect, has the power to transcend time.